Welcome to class. I'm Trevor, and I post D&D videos on Wednesdays. For today's lesson, I want to do two things. First thing, I want to show you how to read a character sheet for D&D 5th edition. And the second thing, I want to make a character. Now, the character we're going to make is going to be a pretty simple character, and I'm not going to use D&D Beyond. I'm going to do it the way I would do it by hand, but on a computer instead. I will show you that resource at the end of this video, just so you can see that it is also available, and it's really useful. So for part one, before we get into character creation, we should review what a character sheet looks like. This is a sample character sheet from the D&D starter set, The Lost Minds of Phandelver. This is just a level 1 human fighter. There's a lot of information on here, and it can get kind of overwhelming to look at a filled-in character sheet, so let's look at a blank one instead. This is a blank, fillable character sheet. Now, my group normally prints these out and uses them by hand, but I think for the purposes of this video, this is going to be a lot clearer of a way to show you. Now, I am a teacher by trade, and I think the easiest way to show you this is to kind of break it down into digestible chunks. So I think the easiest way to go through how to read a character sheet is to start from the top. And if we look at the very top of this character sheet, we have this information. Now, this is the basics. Your character's name, their class and level. You can think of class kind of like job. Background, player name, race, alignment, experience points. The background is something we'll go over during character creation. The player name is you. The race is one of the many fantasy races that you have to pick from, and the new book, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, has also even given you another option for how to handle that, or for how your group might handle that. And then alignment, which is kind of like your character's morality, and experience points, which you may or might not use actual experience points. Instead, your DM might do something called milestone experience, where at certain beats along the story, everyone will level up. If we look at the first column right here on the character sheet, we'll see the 6 important skills that every character in D&D has: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. Now, these are all fairly self-explanatory. Strength is how physically strong you are, dexterity is how agile or quick you are, constitution is how hardy you are, intelligence is smarts, wisdom is kind of how perceptive you are and how intuitive you are, so less book smarts and more street smarts in a way, and charisma is how charming you are, whether that is in persuasion or deception. Now, there are 2 boxes here, 2 places to fill in the character sheet, and that's because you're going to have a larger number, which is your ability score, and that larger number will correspond with a smaller number, which is called the ability score modifier. So if we look, I'll clear these annotations, and if we go back to our sample character, this character is a fighter. We can see that up here in their class. Now they have a 16 in strength. That 16 corresponds to a +3. For the most part, while you're playing a game of D&D, especially in-game, you're going to be using the smaller numbers more consistently than you'll be using the larger numbers. Sometimes when you level up or when you get a very rare magic item, you'll adjust those larger numbers, but for the most part, the smaller numbers are the ones you'll focus on. If we look at the second column on the character sheet, we have these 2 things up here, inspiration and proficiency. Inspiration is something that can be granted by DMs for particularly good roleplay. Some DMs use it, some don't. Proficiency bonus is an addition that you get if you are skilled with something. So if you're using a weapon you know how to use, or if you're doing a particular skill, whether it's charming someone or deceiving someone or doing a magic trick like sleight of hand, you would add your proficiency in addition to the associated skill. Now, proficiency increases at particular level points, and you can kind of tell when you're getting into a new arc of D&D based on when your proficiency score increases, your proficiency bonus increases. The next part can be confusing, especially to new players, and that's called saving throws. Now, your saving throws are determined by your class. And what a saving throw is it's how well equipped your character is to react to something. So if a boulder is coming downhill and you're kind of like Indiana Jones trying to like dodge and duck out of the way of the boulder, your DM might have you roll a dexterity saving throw to kind of mock or mimic that effect of your character running away and dodging out of the way of the boulder. And that is because you're doing it in reaction to something, it's a saving throw. If you get hit by a poison dart in your neck, right, you might have to roll a constitution saving throw to see how hardy you are and if you can fight off the poison. These are saves, again, because they're in reaction to something. If you are choosing to do something, then you're going to very likely be making a skill check. Now, you as the player don't say you're going to do a skill check. Instead, you say, hey, can I walk up to that guard and try to sweet talk them? And your DM might say, okay, roll a persuasion check for me. And what you would do is you would look at your persuasion skill and you would roll the d20 and add your associated score. Now you'll notice when you look at these skills, each of these skills is associated with a different ability. So acrobatics is based on your dexterity, animal handling based on your wisdom, and so on. Which means the modifiers, so the smaller number here, corresponds to these skills. You will carry those over. Now these bubbles indicate which skills you are proficient in. And for those skills, not only will you get the number here, the modifier here, you'll also get your proficiency bonus. This might be a little bit easier if we look at an example. So we can go back to our friend over here. And if we look at their athletics, now this is a fighter, they're kind of an athlete, right? Or the fantasy equivalent. And they have, if we look at their strength score, which is what athletics is based off of, they get a +3 in strength. They also, because it's bubbled in, are proficient in it. So they get an additional +2, which is a +5, which is where that number comes from. Hopefully that makes sense. Then we look at the bottom of this section and we have passive wisdom and other proficiencies. Passive wisdom is just how perceptive you are without actively looking for something or searching through something. And it's 10 plus your wisdom modifier. Other proficiencies in languages, that's where you're going to put what languages your character speaks, what languages they can read, and how good they are at particular tools, thieves' tools, or mason's tools, or smith's tools, things like that. Now, if we look at the middle of the character sheet, we have some other information that's going to come up pretty frequently. So we have armor class, initiative, and speed. Armor class is determined by what armor you're wearing, and each armor will say it's this number plus your dexterity, or it's just this number, and that's how hard you are to hit. And if you're unarmored, your armor class is just 10 plus your dexterity. Now, unless you're a wizard, you're probably going to be wearing some sort of armor, so your armor class will go up from there. There are spells that could also increase this, and having a high armor class is really, really a good way to avoid taking damage in D&D 5th edition. And it works for some classes, and it's harder to do for others. Initiative is how quick you are to get into combat. It's based on your dexterity score. So when a battle breaks out and your DM says roll for initiative, which is kind of the cue that the fight is about to start, you would roll a d20 and add your initiative score. Your speed is determined by your race, and it's just how far you can walk. If you're using a grid, each square or hex is 5 feet, and normally the speeds for characters are between 25 and 40. Some races or even classes get very, very fast as they level up. Monks, for instance, can get a lot of speed. Now, if we look at this next section on the character sheet, we have current hit points, including maximum hit points, which is your HP. It is the numerical equivalent to like how hardy you are, how much you can last. And it's hard to kind of completely wrap your mind around, but it is how willing you are to continue fighting, in essence. There's a lot of argument about exactly what hit points correspond to directly, but when they drop to 0, you're knocked out. Temporary hit points can be granted by certain spells or maybe eating a magical food, and they can let you go above your maximum hit points. Now, they don't stack, so if you have one player who has a spell that gives you 5 temporary hit points and another one that gives you 6, you're not going to end up with 11 because you can't stack temporary hit points on top of each other. Hit die are determined by your class. Now, hit die actually determine your maximum hit points. But depending on what class you are, you'll have a different hit die, and you'll get a new hit die every time you level up. More quote-unquote squishy classes have smaller hit die, and more tough classes have larger hit die. And your HP is determined by your hit die and your constitution modifier. As you level up, you'll either take the average or roll your hit die and add your constitution modifier, and that's how your hit points will increase level to level. Now, death saves, if your character is knocked to 0 hit points in 5th edition, most of the time, you will not automatically die. Instead, when it comes to your turn again, you'll roll a d20, and if you get a 10 or higher, you'll bubble in a success. You're closer to being stabilized. If you roll a 9 or lower, that'll be a failure. You'll bubble in one of the failures. If you get 3 successes, you're stabilized. You still need to be healed. You're probably in rough shape, but you're good. You don't need to worry about being dead. If you get 3 failures, though, then you're dead. Death saves don't carry over. So if you fail, and then succeed 3 times and have this kind of come from behind situation, the failures and the successes all get wiped clean, and the next time your character is dropped to 0 hit points, you would start bubbling in from 0 again. Attacks and spellcasting is the next part. Now, this is where you're going to put your common attacks and like basic cantrips, which are simple spells, You'll put the name of the weapon or cantrip that you're using, the attack bonus, which is often for weapons determined by your strength or dexterity score, as well as your proficiency bonus, and then the damage type, which is specified by the weapon. And you will also add either your strength or your dexterity. Now, one thing to keep in mind, it's a little bit advanced, but you don't add your proficiency to damage. You do add it to the attack. Really what it means is you can be really skilled with a sword, which makes your sword more likely to hit, but it doesn't mean your sword is going to do more damage than someone else's sword. The damage you're doing is based on your skill, right? Your strength or dexterity. And with spells, it depends on the class, what score you're adding for particular spells. There's a lot of room here because there are certain weapons that you can use with one hand or two hands, or you can use it with dexterity instead of strength. But really what it boils down to, and it's not all that complicated because there are a lot of options, but it funnels down, and really all you'll have to pay attention to is what's presented on your character sheet. And you get more options incrementally as you level up, which can make the game exciting and fun rather than overwhelming, which is what it can feel like at first glance. This last section is for equipment. Now, there's markings for currency here, and any equipment you have, you'll put in this box. Now, every time I've ever played a game of D&D, my players have needed more room for equipment than just these boxes here. They've used a separate sheet of paper, they've used a journal or something else. But you can start by putting your simple equipment here, including your starting equipment. The last section of the character sheet has a really awesome thing that 5th edition does, which are your personality traits and your bonds, ideals, and flaws. This will help you role play your character. You can describe what they're like. You can even, and there's room on a character sheet on the next page to describe like their physical description, but this is more how they behave. What do they value? Are they honorable above all else? Or are they determined to protect their hometown or the love of their life or whatever it is? Maybe they're greedy and they're just in it for money and they'll do anything to make a quick buck. There's so much here, and they're so simple, like conceptually, but it really helps you develop a character that's way more realistic than just like a generic kind of superhero archetype or something like that. The last part of the character sheet is features and traits. Now, depending on your race and class, you'll get a lot of different features and traits throughout the game, and you'll add to this section of the character sheet as you level up and as you progress throughout your journey of D&D 5th edition. If we look back at our character sheet now, the sample character, it's a little bit less overwhelming, right? If we remember, this is basic information. This top part of the character sheet is just basic information about the player and the character. Obviously, some of the things like the player name and the character name are left blank because that's yours to fill in. You decide that. We have our scores here. We have our proficiency bonus, our saving throws, the skills. Armor class is 17, -1 initiative, which corresponds, like I said earlier, to the dexterity modifier. All of these things hopefully are falling into place and making a little bit more sense. And you can see some of the skills as well that a first level fighter would get, but we'll do this when we create our character. So moving on to part 2. So in part 2 of the video, we're going to create a sample character for 5th edition. Now I'm going to make a fighter in this video. And if you want me to make a more complex class, like a spellcaster, I'm happy to do that in a later video. For this character, I came up with the idea of a dwarf bodyguard, in a sense, who protected the local church and learned the art of winemaking and brewery from that church. Now, for some of you who maybe have played D&D before, this might sound a little bit like a cleric or a paladin, but I want to show you just how flexible different race and class combinations can be, and I don't want anyone to ever feel like pigeonholed in what they're playing. So I'm not going to name the character. If you have a suggestion for that, you can drop it in the comments below. I wrote some personality traits. In my head, this character is a gruff person. They have a heart of gold, but they need a little bit of time to open up. In terms of ideals, they're responsible. They want to help people, especially those who are in need. Bonds, they're bonded to a friend of theirs, another acolyte of the church where they worked. Maybe this person was a cleric, and you could, if you choose to play this character, develop that person more in depth, or let your DM do that. As a forever DM, having something like this, a character who's gone missing, is just a blessing because it lets me interweave your story into the narrative that I'm creating for us. And for flaws, they're a bit rough around the edges, and they don't know how to make small talk super well. For class, background, and race, I did fighter, acolyte, and hill dwarf, respectively. Now we're going to generate stats. And if we look, we have 6 stats. So what we're going to do is we're going to roll 4 d6, or normal Yahtzee die, and drop the lowest 6 times. Now, there's a website where we can do this for ourselves, so I'll roll a new character. Now, these are the scores that I got. Not too shabby, right? As a matter of fact, this looks pretty similar to what's called the standard array. The standard array is a list of suggested stats, and it's another option to generate a character. I'm not the biggest fan of the standard array. I prefer doing it this way. The important thing to keep in mind is that that bonus, the plus or minus number, changes at even numbers, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill these into our sample character sheet and then explain my reasoning behind it. So I went with 15 strength, 11 dexterity, 14 constitution, 10 intelligence, 12 wisdom, and 8 charisma. In my head for this character, they're going to be a strength-based fighter. So strength being their highest score is really important. Fighters are also on the front lines of battle a lot, so you're going to want a high constitution, which will give you a high HP, which will mean you'll last longer in a fight. Now, before we put the bonuses in, we need to see what benefits we get from choosing a dwarf as our race. Now, I mentioned that I was going to talk about the effects that Tasha's Cauldron of Everything had. What Tasha's did is it said, you know, player characters are heroes. They're special, and we should not necessarily treat them just as we do every other character from a particular race. So it decoupled the statistics bonuses, or the stat bonuses, from the races. Now, I'm going to stick with the original from the SRD just for the sake of expediency and teaching you. But if you talk to your DM and you're like, hey, can I, instead of getting +2 in dexterity, can I put it in strength? I can almost guarantee they'll say yes. And if not, then that's fine. They just want to run a game that's more strict to the rules in the player's handbook. So because I'm a dwarf, I get +2 to my constitution. And because I'm a hill dwarf, I get an additional +1 to my wisdom. Now I'll fill in the modifiers for these stats. Now we can start to fill in the information for being a dwarf. And I'll fill that stuff in really quickly. Now I've added everything to the character sheet that comes with being a dwarf. So I get dark vision, dwarven resilience, stone cunning, which lets me figure out the origins of stonework, dwarven toughness, which we'll get to when I make my HP, dwarven combat training, which gives me proficiency in certain weapons, and my languages, which are dwarvish and common. So I moved the things over for the Acolyte background. I chose Halfling and Gnomish as my additional languages. I bubbled in Insight and Religion, because those are the skills I get for being an Acolyte. And I tweaked some of the wording to make sure that I had enough room to include all of the features and traits. Shield of the Faithful means that because I'm an Acolyte, if I stumble across another temple that worships the same god that I worshipped, then they're going to help me out and give me a hand and heal up me and maybe my team because we have the same religion in common. Now I'll update the character sheet for the aspects of the fighter class at level 1, and then we'll wrap things up. So I just moved everything over for the fighter class, and that finishes out our character sheet. With the fighter class, we get a D10 hit die. And using that, we take the max at first level, which is 10, plus our constitution, which is 3, plus 1 because dwarven toughness. Your hit point maximum increases by 1, and then you gain 1 every time you gain level, which totals 14. Our armor class is based on the chainmail armor that we got at character creation, plus our defense fighting style that we got from being a fighter. Chainmail armor gives us 16, and AC is increased by 1 to 17. Now, if we're using our shield, that would increase to 19 armor class. Because we're a fighter, we also got second wind. On our turn, we can use a bonus action to regain hit points equal to 1d10 plus our fighter level, which recharges on a short or long rest. So in part 2 of the video, I wanted to create a character. I went through all the steps and I created a character. Now in my head, this character is a former dwarvish bodyguard who was kind of the guard of the local temple or church. I didn't create a name for this character. I left some of it up for interpretation, so you'd be able to slot in whatever you wanted if you choose to play with the character. If you do decide to play the character and you come up with a name, drop it in the comments for me. This is a level 1 fighter with the Acolyte background because they worked with the church. They're a hill dwarf, and I use the normal rules for character creation rather than Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. I generated the stats using a number generator. You roll 4d6, drop the lowest, and you do that 6 times. That's how you get the larger numbers, and those correspond to the ability score modifiers. Based on my background and my class, I got these skills, specifically athletics, insight, intimidation, and religion. And then based on my class, I got my 2 saving throws, strength and constitution, because I'm a fighter. The class also determined my hit die, which is a d10, and because of a combination of my class, my high constitution, and the fact that I'm a dwarf, I ended up with 14 as my maximum HP. My armor class is based on the chainmail that I'm wearing, my dwarvish toughness, and whether or not I'm using my shield. So it's either 17 or 19, but because I have chainmail, I'm less sneaky, which means I have disadvantage on stealth checks. My thought for this character was that they were a dwarvish bodyguard for a local temple, and they had a friend at some point that maybe it went missing. It was maybe another bodyguard or a cleric that frequented the temple, and because this person went missing, they decided to leave their town, maybe for the first time in their life, and they're on this quest to find their friend. They're kind of gruff, they're rough around the edges, they're not the most social person, but after a nice glass of wine, they kind of open up and cool down, and they really do have a good heart. They want what's best, especially for the common people. I went with the whole cup of wine thing because this character has proficiency with brewer's tools from the Acolyte background, so that's how I kind of played that into their character. Now, I mentioned that I would talk a little bit about D&D Beyond, despite the fact that I didn't use it to create our sample character. This is what the sign-in page for D&D Beyond looks like. And in D&D Beyond, once you sign in, if you go to Tools and Character Creator, you can go through all the steps of the character creation process right here. It'll walk you through generating your name, your race, your class, your abilities, and it really helps when there are situations where maybe a skill you get from your background and your class overlap with one another. It'll let you know so you don't miss out on any of those valuable points. Again, a lot of campaigns run using D&D Beyond or something similar. I tend to run on paper, and that's why I wanted to go through the paper character creation process to the best of my ability. I think it's useful to know how this all works and where all of these numbers and widgets and information comes from, but this is a really great way. And honestly, it's a great way to just make random characters to see what goes where. Now, unless you've purchased content, you're only really going to have access to some things, some homebrew stuff, and some of the free content that's available, but you can purchase digital versions of a lot of the books through D&D Beyond. If you end up using this character in a game, please let me know, and hopefully this video made the character creation process and how to read a D&D 5e character sheet easier. If you want me to go through how to make a more complex character or provide samples of other characters or anything like that, let me know in the comments. And as always, be safe, make smart life choices.